Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to try to stick to the time that I was given. So apologies if I don't go into too much detail about our research. I think you will have more detail in the slides actually than what I'm going to cover here. So together with Loic, we are going to introduce you to our research. ScopeSEND is the project that I am leading. And then later on, we partnered with CES.
Yeah, most likely.
So I'm going to start with ScopeSEND, and just to say I'm the principal investigator, but a lot of the research was actually conducted by my lovely colleagues, including Catherine, who is present here today, and we will probably be best placed to answer some of the questions. You can ask her some questions as well. What was the goal of this research? We really wanted to do a comprehensive examination of the policies regulating SEND provision across other jurisdictions, so we could learn lessons from what's happening in other contexts to hopefully inform policy change in England. How did we select our jurisdictions? We did have a very thorough process of selecting the jurisdictions that presented indicators of some good practice in terms of SEND policy, but there was also one criterion related to jurisdictions that were important for England in terms of cultural and geographical proximity, and jurisdictions that otherwise were very different culturally and linguistically from England, so we could have a comprehensive comparison of SEND policy. We started with the first pool of countries, so it's the 4 UK nations, Ireland, Australia, Switzerland, Finland, and Belgium. And then as we partnered with CES, we extended our pool of jurisdictions to the jurisdictions that are covered by the Centre for Education Systems. In terms of our research questions, they are complementary. So I'm just going to give you an overview of how we structured our research questions. The first one is very much, how do the systems compare? What are the main differences? So very descriptive. The second one is, how do those differences are reflected in outcomes? But we were not so much interested in outcomes in terms of hard scores, literacy, maths, the traditional outcomes. We were more interested in how stakeholders experience the different policy systems. And when we say stakeholders, we mean practitioners, we mean families, and we mean children and young people as well. Then we were interested in identifying cases of success. Where can we see positive experiences of the system and why? And this was never about finding one jurisdiction that does it very well. It was about finding elements of policy in a specific context that could then be transferred to a different context and that generate positive experiences. That was always the goal. And so the fourth research question, although it's very different to establish cause and effect relationships in this kind of research, we wanted to identify some patterns. What are then the things that might lead to positive experiences in terms of policy design and implementation?
Okay, so as you can see, if you then compare those over to the CES questions, these are a set of 6 questions that cross all studies that the Centre for Education Systems does. And you can see the strong overlap there, but part of the rationale for us is the idea that you can only judge the success of policies if you understand what their purpose is. Different countries are trying to do different things, so we really brought that out, and that's something I'm going to turn to in a short while. Those descriptive questions around structure, and then we're also particularly interested in how policies are introduced, because we know particularly in an area like SEND, the way stakeholders, parents, young people are brought into that process or not, and the structures that exist to develop policies are really important, as does that constant reviewing through evaluation. So we wanted to understand countries' approaches to that. And our approach is always to consider context. So we think of policies combining with contexts to result in effects. And therefore, we pull that out discreetly and try and map both how the context has shaped the policy, but also how that context shapes the effects of the policy.
So how did we do this? How did we actually look at the policies to identify how SEND is implemented? We had indicators of interests that we defined at the beginning of the project. So first of all, we were interested in how SEND or equivalent term or concept is defined in the different jurisdictions. We do use the term SEND in our research because it is the official term in England. We do realize that there are limitations around this term. And so we looked at how other jurisdictions had equivalent concepts and the implications of that for the eligibility process and the different benchmarks in that process, but also for the assessment process for SEND support, and also for what the different statutory and non-statutory plans look like. But we also looked at whether different systems have a state-funded, or the extent to which they have a state-funded early childhood intervention system beyond just a purely early childhood education system. When we talk about early childhood intervention, or ECI as we say it in the scientific community, we're talking about a much more systemic process that involves health, education and social care from birth. And it necessarily implies that there is cross-sector provision to an extent. So we were looking at how much that happens in the different jurisdictions and how. We also, as we looked at the different policies, we felt that it was important to identify which jurisdictions have specific focus on their policy. So some jurisdictions have specific policies for mental health, specific anti-bullying policies, specific policies for inclusion as well. So we looked at that and the implications of that. We looked at workforce training and preparedness, both in pre-service and in-service and continuous professional development. And then we tried to look at other indicators as well, such as data records, inspections and appeal systems, but unfortunately we didn't really get that much data about those indicators. And I'm just going to I'm not going to bore you with academic theories of child development, but I do think it's very important to explain that at some point we did feel that we had to define what we mean by a policy that is more inclusive. As much as we want to try and stay neutral from the point of view of research, we're also informed by theory and by previous research. And we felt that that was important to provide a background and a framework for how we interpreted the different policies. And it is well recognized today in the field of child development and education that we understand that children develop based on a number of different influencing factors, biological factors, but also external factors at different levels. And that's very much the framework that we adopted in our analysis as well. We used the input process output model of policy analysis, according to which any policy analysis is only complete if we look at the policies themselves, but also the effect that that has on how children experience it. So that's the macro level influencing child development and family life. So we very much framed our research within this theoretical background. We also started thinking more about what do we mean by an inclusive system. And for many years, we have agreed to disagree on what inclusion means. And we're starting to think that perhaps we can agree on some aspects of it, or that there is enough out there for us to agree on some aspects of it. We do know, and there's plenty of evidence around about that inclusion is more than just placement in mainstream settings. There is evidence of children being placed in mainstream settings who do not feel that they belong in those settings, and vice versa. And so I very much like the model of Fortrup and Portrup that highlights inclusion as placement, but also as levels of belonging in specific contexts. So we use that as our framing. And we also know that inclusion is more than providing services to children who have a label, even though labels may be very important for a variety of reasons. But it's not just that. And so we wanted to focus on defining inclusive systems rather than just inclusive education. Really, to understand SEND policy, we need to look at the intersections of education with health and social care and justice at certain points. So we do have a definition of inclusion that defines it as a systemic process that supports all children in an equitable way to access, but also to actively engage in the everyday life opportunities. It's not just about access, it's about engagement and the quality of that engagement, leading to belonging and overall flourishing, and accounting for the intersection between all aspects of development over time. So it's quite a long definition, but it does include all of the elements that we think is important to look at. So based on this theoretical framework, we looked at the different policies. We have over 200 policies. Catherine may correct me if I'm wrong, but we have over 200 policies across different jurisdictions. And we did first a content analysis, which is very much qualitative, and we interpreted the policies against the theory. But then we really also wanted to validate that with more quantitative data. So we did statistical analysis of the text of the policies across jurisdictions as well. And this is what I'm going to summarize here today. Very much as a result of our content analysis, we concluded, and a very similar conclusion was obtained by our partners at CES, that the different jurisdictions can be placed in a continuum between those that define SEND or equivalent more towards a medical model, okay, and those that define SEND more towards a biopsychosocial model or needs-led approach. So we have, for example, Belgium, France, Japan, and Poland are very much towards the medical model side of this spectrum because they very much rely on diagnostic categories or diagnostic processes to define who has SEND or equivalent. And then we have on the other side, Estonia, Finland, Ireland, Scotland, Switzerland, and Wales, very much having a needs-based biopsychosocial approach with very broad definitions of what SEND or additional support or equivalent may mean. In some jurisdictions, Scotland, for example, bereavement can be considered and is given as an example in policy of a situation where a child may be eligible for support services. Very different from a medical orientation to support. And then we have England and other jurisdictions having a hybrid approach and somewhere in the middle. This is just looking at the policies themselves from the point of view of the input. So just looking at the policies, not at the experience.
Okay, so I mentioned that with the starting point for a lot of research we do at CES is the question of what is the purpose and what is trying to be achieved here. So this is just a summary of some of what we found when we started to look into these policies in these different countries and what they said they were trying to achieve. And we divided up into three main purposes. So you've got inclusion broadly conceived of, which is a lot to do with sense of belonging in the way it's framed in policy language. And then you have questions of being able to participate in society, so much further on into life, building social cohesion, those types of goals. And then finally, economic participation, so more labour market focused goals. And all three of those can be generally found in most countries, but with a different sort of weighting to some degree. So we're able to start looking at how that played out, and you can see some kind of examples of countries that made this particularly manifest there. But these are never static. And what we also wanted to understand was what were countries trying to do? Where were they moving? What were their agendas in the types of policies that they were introducing and the reforms they were making? And there again, there were sort of three main trends. So Josh mentioned earlier on the sort of the mainstream as a very common goal. So a lot of countries aiming to reduce the number of pupils who are taught outside of the mainstream. Susana's just talked about this medicalised versus needs-based, and there's a very common sense that countries have come from a medicalised view and are now aiming to move towards a needs-based approach. And finally, the integration across services, so the classic breaking down the silos, understanding the interactions with other services. But what was striking with each of these was how widespread difficulties in achieving those goals were. So what we see is that countries around the world are actually grappling with some of the same challenges, where they're finding that they have these ambitions, but are finding it quite hard to meet those. But they're being driven by different things. And one of the things I noticed when I was doing interviews with policymakers and, interviewing ministers from different countries and so on, was the extent to which in many countries this is really driven by things like the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability or EU agendas and so on, and that being a bit more absent in the narrative in England in policy. So that was one of the things that just stood out quite early on in terms of the purposes and the direction of travel.
Very good. So some of these trends that we observed more qualitatively, both ourselves in our analysis of policy, but also CES in the interviews and analysis of policy that they conducted, we then wanted to validate a bit more with quantitative analysis of the policy text. So what we did was using corpus analysis, which is a technique from linguistics. We did some we analyzed differences between countries in terms of how much they use certain words. So we picked some words in the policy that are very much related to a medicalized approach. So for example, the mention to diagnosis, the mention to deficit, the term autism, the term ADHD. And we looked at how different countries use that. And we can see, for example, here that Singapore uses these terms a lot more frequent and mostly with large effects compared to the other countries, very much validating our understanding of the policy that this jurisdiction has a conceptualization of SEND that is more towards the medical side of things. And then we looked at other words that were more related to the biopsychosocial side of the spectrum, so the more needs-based approach to policy. And so, for example, we looked at the term well-being, and we saw it is far more common in Australia, Wales, and Scotland than in other jurisdictions, and in England, less than most other jurisdictions. We looked at the term inclusion and saw that it's far more common in Ireland with very large effect sizes and less common in England than all other jurisdictions. The term belonging, again, more common in Australia and New Zealand, and England less than in any other jurisdictions except Northern Ireland and Singapore. Participation, same thing, more common in Australia and Ireland and far less common in England than all other jurisdictions. Now, this is what I think the most interesting part of the project, which is where we can start observing how policy change really affects things. We also did a sentiment analysis of the policy. So we used existent databases based on the British dictionary, the British corpus, only for the countries that have policies written in English. And we looked at the sentiment of that policy. So words in the policy that have already been classified by others in these data sets as either positive or very positive or less positive. You will be pleased to know that all jurisdictions have positive sentiments. That is very good news. But what we can see is very, very big differences in the extent of positive sentiment that the different jurisdictions express. So Scotland is very, very positive at the top. England, less positive, and we used 2 data sets to validate this. So England is less positive across 2 data sets. What we did in February was we added to our huge set of policies 3 documents. We added the white paper, Every Child Achieving and Thriving, we added the consultation document, and we added the neurodivergence task and finish report. And what we see was a big jump in England's sentiment towards positivity.
Okay, so moving on from those kind of purposes and values behind the policies, we now need to think about what the policies actually look like. And I think of this as a bit of a kind of architecture of a system. So what we're trying to do with our research is to set out the big choices that policies are going to have to make, and what the building blocks of a policy system are. And so we've got 4 main components there, which we find across different systems. So we say, okay, what are the components of these policies? How are they putting together policies? So first is assessment and identification, then learner support, accountability, and funding. So you can think of those almost as the 4 key ingredients in a policy system for SEND. So I'm going to give you some quick reflections on each of those. So the first is around assessment, as I say. And here we see a lot of a reflection of exactly what Susana was talking about in terms of medical versus needs-based approaches and so on. So we can see that there are differences in what triggers SEND support across countries. Sometimes the doctors are more involved in that than in other countries. There's questions in terms of who's then doing an assessment or who escalates a need to a higher level. And sometimes the locus of control is within the school, is a SENCO, for example, whereas elsewhere, there's a much more of a role for the external. And obviously this varies at different levels of support, but we can see some of those themes come in. And then what results in that escalation? That then links to a support model and where a young person gets put in terms of what they're allocated in terms of support. And we see that most countries have some form of tiering of that support. The sole exception we could really find was Japan, but even there decisions then get made about whether a child is educated in the classroom, an inclusion base, or in a specialist school. So really there's some form of kind of triaging happening everywhere. But the really interesting distinctions which we set out in the report are to do with what you get at different levels. So for example, how high up the tiering system do you need to be to get access to specialist support, for example? That can really vary between countries. So even though you might hear about lots of countries sharing a free tier system, that looks really different when you look at it in practice. And then we come to what the support looks like as a whole within that system. And we've broken that down into 4 levels there. So firstly, teacher training, which is a component of any attempt to support young people with special needs. And there are 3 big distinctions here. So we can kind of pile up these different levels of choices that have to be made. Firstly, how much of your training happens when you're initially training as a teacher in your initial course versus further on in your career or as an ongoing basis? Where is that positioned? Secondly, do you get training on each different condition, or is it more about understanding need as a whole, that kind of biosocial model, for example? And then thirdly, are all teachers expected to develop expertise in SEND, or just specialist teachers? Different countries position themselves differently on those. Then we get these different adaptations, and you can see, in England, there was a move away from teaching assistants in policy rhetoric for a while, but other countries have gone the other way, like France has put a huge investment in training up people as teaching assistants and so on. So we see a shift there. And then the specific interventions, and that goes back to that point about what you get at what tier. So for example, in Ireland, this kind of visiting teacher service, so you have external support within the mainstream, and we can see that being echoed in some of the reforms that are coming through in England. And then finally, the question of mainstream and specialist, which is a feature of all systems. Accountability, we find that countries really struggle with accountability in this area. Sometimes partly because it's hard to compare outcomes, partly because there's risks of various kind of perverse incentives and so on. So this is one of the benefits of the fact that CES also studies things like accountability, so we can draw links here. And we find that across accountability systems like England, there's generally a focus on outcome-based accountability, but that becomes hard to apply in an area like SEND. And therefore, a lot of accountability ends up shifting to the process, things like inspection, although that's not used as much as it might be, and then inputs, which is much more to do with compliance and regulatory things. So you end up having a different approach to accountability in SEND compared to elsewhere. But also you get less of a focus on the individual school. So you have many more arrangements for things like accountability across a network of schools or a community. Or system-wide kind of sampling research, say like Ofsted doing a report on SEND across the system. So you get a different approach to accountability. The unit of analysis is no longer just the school, it might be a group of schools. And again, we see echoes of that in some of the reforms that are coming through in England in terms of accountability at a trust level, but also questions about how you make that align. If we have trust inspection, but support being provided to within local authorities, how do you marry up those 2 different units for accountability? And finally, the all-important question of funding. So here we have a question of who's involved in it, where does it come from? But that's not just about, you've got 2 dimensions there, who is allocating funding and who is providing funding. And we see in cases like Finland and Japan, where local government plays quite a big role in sourcing the money, you can actually end up with quite big regional disparities. And then in some of these countries, which might have smaller populations and so on, you can have even more. You can have an even more centralisation than we see in other systems. So there's a question of the roles of different levels and the degree of centralisation across systems, and then the question of whether pupil funding is allocated to a specific pupil, as we have with something like an EHCP, or whether it's based on what pupils are in an area or in a school. And there are real trade-offs here. You know, the question of, does an individual pupil have an entitlement to a package of money, or do you want the flexibility to bring that funding in and out? And that's being grappled with in lots of places, and you see systems shift from one system to another, like Finland moving away, moving a bit more towards a census-based system where it's allocated at group level. So those kind of shifts there. So the goal there, through those different areas I've talked about, is to provide this kind of map here, which is like, this is our architecture. These are the building blocks of the SEND system. And these point policymakers and decision makers and all of you who are influencing SEND policy to think about what should each of those components of that system look like, because that's where the big choices are.
Brilliant. So I'm going to take now 2 minutes to summarize the output side of all this. So we looked at the policies and we did interviews with policymakers. How do the users of the system perceive these things? We did 2 different things. We did a systematic evidence review of what has already been published across jurisdictions, because a lot of this research has already been conducted in the different countries that we're looking at. So we really wanted to gauge that. And then from there, we identified gaps, things that weren't covered by the existing research, and we did interviews across jurisdictions. We are doing interviews across jurisdictions, 181 to date, the last time I checked, maybe more now. So what we found in 2 minutes was that there are similarities in the way that people experience SEND policy. And those similarities have to do with navigating the SEND system is often found complex and bureaucratic, and that's across the board. And this tends to be more apparent. We have seen in our interviews in jurisdictions that are more medical model based in the way that they understand SEND. Practitioner training in CPD is a challenge. Families especially often mention lack of knowledge of how to address certain needs in mainstream settings, the issue of supporting a range of different needs within mainstream settings is highlighted across jurisdictions as well. And across jurisdictions, the issue of relationships and communication between families and schools and the ease of the communication channels between families and schools seems to be very important and has been identified as the key positive thing that leads to more positive experiences. In fact, as I said, it's very difficult to establish cause and effect, so all of these things are suggestions and indications, but we did see in Finland and Scotland, which if I may remind you, are jurisdictions that are more at the needs-based level of the spectrum, a more balanced accounts between positive experiences and negative experiences. In England, we found mostly negative experiences. And this happened, this was, so what I just said was visible in our evidence review, but then we also found that in the interviews that we conducted directly with the different jurisdictions. So the challenge is very similar, but there are key facilitators, which are clear pathways for support and guidance for families and good communication with schools, coordinated multi-agency working, and in some cases, specialist provision. And this was particularly highlighted by families with children with complex medical needs often. Okay, there is in your, if you have the slides, you have more detail about the different jurisdictions. I'll just highlight as a key facilitator in Scotland, the inclusive ethos, which has been mentioned by participants and I think reflects the language that we showed, which is a lot more inclusive. And in Switzerland, the existence of strong early childhood intervention and multi-service engagement as a facilitator. More detail in the slides.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. I'm not going to go through these, but just leave those up. There's a kind of 5 key takeaways that came from across the findings that we're seeing across those countries. And we also have a set of kind of 8 big choices. So given that architecture and given what we know about some of these trends that Susana set out, we set those out as being the kind of 8 cruxy questions that we need to just ask for a system to make some decisions.